Hello, welcome to this week's episode of the Human Enhancement Podcast. This is your host, Jeffrey Wu. And one of the topics that we've touched up across multiple conversation is the gut microbiome. I think there's more and more science and data showing that there's this gut-brain axis and interesting research showing that, the gut microbiome could be considered a forgotten organ, and it affects so many different endpoints in health, performance, etc. So excited to have an expert in this space, Jain, who's the co-founder and CEO of Sun Genomics, to talk about the gut microbiome and what work they're doing. So happy to have you on the program.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I'm glad to be here on the podcast and excited to reach out to your listeners and engage more people about their microbiome.
Yeah, perfect. I always like to start with a background. How did you get into this space? I know you've done some graduate work in cellular biology, microbiology. What is your background and what got you focused on the microbiome?
Yeah, my background is in microbiology as a BS and molecular medicine master's, and transitioned that academic experience into clinical molecular diagnostics. Worked for several companies creating assays for reference laboratories on the molecular side, including LabCorp and Sequenome. And most recently worked for Illumina for 7 years, bringing next-gen sequencing technology into a clinical laboratory setting and human genome sequencing into a laboratory setting. So my experiences have really kind of come full circle in that I've kind of brought next-gen sequencing technology and understanding to now the microbiome side of things, where I started my BS with. So I'm really fortunate enough to get to leverage all the past experiences I've had into this new venture.
Interesting. For those who might not realize, but Illumina is the company that builds all the hardware that all the genetic testing companies use, right? So like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, all those guys are essentially built on top of Illumina. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly right. And in fact, when I joined Illumina, those were some of the key projects going on, was ramping those guys up and beginning to understand how people engage with their personal genomics was really a fortunate part of being at Illumina during that time. And it's only gotten more and more integrated into mainstream and the mass market now. And so it's just an exciting time for personal genomics overall.
Yeah. So I guess when you were at Illumina, you saw this opportunity with the gut microbiome. And I guess that's how you transitioned from like, okay, I've done 7 years at Illumina. What was there a catalyst that was like, oh, wow, this is the next big opportunity where I need to do this myself?
Well, one thing that I found very interesting when we would sequence human genomes, there was a fair amount of sequence that would go left unused. And that was from saliva samples. And I almost wondered what that unused information was. And we later found out that that was mostly bacterial. And really, that's the oral microbiome that is being sequenced but not used for what the product was. And that to me was an interesting thing of, well, shouldn't we look at that information? Shouldn't we try to understand that information? And around that same time, the Human Microbiome Project completed in 2012. The American Gut Project took off in 2014. There was this huge explosion in computational sciences and understanding microbiome data, and it all just kind of came together. And in 2016, we started Sun Genomics. The real switching point, though, I must say, was a personal one, in that my son had a dysbiosis, which is when there's a shift in good or bad microbes of your gut. And it was a call to action for my wife and I to understand what should we do next? Should we put him on probiotics? Should we understand his gut microbiome? And a combination of the two. And that really is what drove the company forward to where we are today.
So how did you know it was a gut microbiome issue? Was it just, the standard care, the doctors didn't know what's going on and you guys did your own homework there? Or how did you know that the microbiome was the root cause?
Yeah, a little bit of that, but we had great care. But it did manifest as sort of, his stool movements and things like that early on were not where they should be, and you could tell that there were some gastrointestinal issues from the symptom side of things, and we wanted to understand what exactly were those issues from a microbial standpoint, or if there's anything we could do. There's now science that says you should seed and colonize your gut microbiome in the first 1,000 days of life. And if you aren't properly seeding that microbiome in the first 1,000 days of life, that could be what is leading us to this increased incidence of allergies and asthmas in our population. So seeding it correctly became critically important for our decision making with our son.
Interesting. So I guess like the way I've been looking at the gut microbiome has been through a couple different lenses. So I have a friend, I don't know if we should actually get him on the podcast. His name is Josiah Zainer. He was one of the first people to implant fecal microbiome, I guess like sort of as a biohacker, to transplant that into his own system and see if that's seeded. And that was to cure his own sort of gut issues. And then you've had a lot of, I guess, interest around supplements or foodstuffs to help shift different microbiome makeup to drive certain types of outcomes. I think there's emerging science that suggests that, a healthy person's gut microbiome looks very different from an obese person's microbiome. What is the peer review literature out there in this space? Because I know, my sense of this space is that a lot of people are experimenting and having hypotheses, but there's quite a bit of research still to be done to prove out some of the indications. What is your sense of the cutting edge here?
Yeah, we are definitely seeing an exponential ramp up in publications in this year versus last year versus the year before. It is just tremendous. I'd say there's 10,000 publications related to profiling microbiomes and specific disease areas in the last 2 years alone. So there's an incredible wealth of knowledge to leverage at this point into real products. And in understanding categories of profiles, as you're describing, obese versus normal, we're still on that exploration stage of, okay, what is considered normal? We do understand what is considered sort of the disease state from a full profile in IBS, in NASH, in different types of diet types, in obesity. So you could consider maybe normal in that sense as if you don't have those profiles, right? The other thing you could consider is normal is whatever your normal is. And so if you haven't tested your gut microbiome, you don't really know what your normal is. So you don't know what changes from time point 1 to time point 2. And so that's really what we want people to begin their journey to understand what their normal is. And we offer all sorts of comparisons then to, 10,000 profiles from a healthy individual data set compared to you. But I think the first step is just understanding what's normal for you. And if you do have something there, then making some adjustments to your life.
And then as someone that, for our listeners out there that might not be up to speed on all the different biotics, what's the difference between a prebiotic, probiotic, do you need extra fibers to be, a substrate for the probiotics to actually bind to? Can you elucidate, all different pieces of how one, all those terms and how do you actually, what do you actually want? What is legit? What is not legit?
Yeah, so there's 3 key terms probably, which is prebiotics, probiotics, and then what they're calling postbiotics. And those are sort of at the 3 stages. Prebiotics, of course, is a delivery of some sort of molecule that is before your probiotic, and it provides nutritional benefit to probiotics in your gut, or delivered with your probiotics to provide nutritional benefit to the
So like
probiotics.
What compounds would be considered a prebiotic?
Things like you might see the terms FOS or MOS, FOS or MOS. These are oligosaccharides.
Okay.
And those are food for the probiotics. Also,
like complex
things.
carbohydrates, essentially, like complex carbohydrates. Okay.
Yeah, and other things that are also being recognized as prebiotics could include fiber, as you're mentioning.
Yeah.
But there's several other things also that we're beginning to study as understanding as food sources for the good microbes of our gut. Even probiotics themselves could be prebiotics for the other probiotics in our gut. And we're beginning to understand the levels that interplay here. So probiotics, by definition, are living organisms that survive the gastric system and provide and confer a health benefit to the host.
Yeah.
And that those organisms actually can live in our intestines. They can get into the mucocin layer. They could even bind the epithelial cells there. And if they release any beneficial molecules like a vitamin, that would be considered a postbiotic. So something that a probiotic can release is considered a postbiotic. And so you can actually take probiotics that give you your vitamin supply.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't have to necessarily take all the different vitamins. So the probiotics can have different characteristics depending on which strain.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something that was interesting, that some probiotics are prebiotics for other probiotics. So you're literally feeding bacteria to other bacteria. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. In essence, we now understand there's an interplay between these organisms in our gut. And so certain probiotics work to drive down bad microbes, and certain probiotics actually can help their fellow colleagues or good microbes in bringing their concentrations up.
And how deep does a personalization go? Where are we on defining, we want 50% of type A bacteria, 25% of type B bacteria, and then a plethora of C, D, E type bacteria for these types of use cases versus, for example, one might be eating a low carb, high fat diet or a ketogenic diet. You want your microfauna to be optimized for breaking down higher fat content. Or if someone is eating more of a mixed diet and eating more complex carbohydrates, your microfauna should probably look a little bit different. How far along are we to be able to define those in a more rigorous way? I mean, I think that to me seems to be a bit of the holy grail in this space, where it's like, okay, I want to be focused on these types of outcomes, whether I really want to be a super endurance athlete, or I want to be a heavy power lifter, or my type of work schedule is very, very cognitively demanding for long periods of time. One would imagine that your microfauna should be optimized for those specific, human outcomes. It seems to me that the science is early there, but what's the pathway? How do we get there? Can we get there? Is that just a pipe dream?
It's a very interesting question. I think what you're talking about are what we would consider modalities. So what is the mode of your microbiome to what your phenotype is, or what you're doing or trying to achieve? So if it's performance weightlifting, then we are seeing that those performance athletes have particular microbes that are really beneficial for them to endure that strenuous exercise. And we're being able to profile those individuals more and more and building these data sets to understand the commonalities. Not all of those beneficial microbes are readily available today as probiotics. So even though, Jeff, you have an amazing triathlon and you get these great microflora from it, it doesn't mean that we could harvest those and provide them back to somebody else just yet. And then they would become an amazing triathlete. Right. But we are understanding that there are these next-gen probiotics that we need to begin to cultivate. The probiotics have been around for decades, and they're well understood from a safety standpoint. They're on the FDA's generally regarded as safe list. And so those are the ones we've started with at Sun Genomics. So we know what those can do. And as best as we can, we'll help the different modalities that you're describing with that original set. In a few years, we totally think that this will change as far as what are the different types of probiotics we'll have access to. In fact, we're working on growing and manufacturing our own next-gen probiotics so that we can be ready for the different modalities that people want to achieve.
Cool. Yeah, I would definitely want to stay up to speed and stay connected to get the updates there. Do you have, I always like to hear personal anecdotes or stories here. I mean, I think that helps, make some of these techniques concrete. I mean, how did it work on your son? I mean, hopefully some of your techniques actually improved his symptoms. I mean, I imagine you're a first power user of your own service. I mean, have you noticed changes or what are the quantified, outcomes there?
Yeah, so in my son's case, that was sort of patient number one, I guess.
Yeah.
And so we did, at that time, there weren't real customized or personalized solutions. And so what I ended up having to do was once I figured out how to do the microbiome testing, meaning like reviewing the different types of technologies out there versus 16S versus shotgun sequencing, adding in just beyond bacterial analysis into the fungi, the yeasts, the viruses, the phages, the parasites, really adding that database of microbial content and understanding. Once we were able to get his full profile back, then my wife and I had to have a decision-making session, and it wasn't easy. I had to convince my wife that I want to put my son on these probiotics based off of this profile.
Yeah.
And she had trepidation in that. Well, how do we know these are going to work, and how do we know that they don't have contaminants? So we actually tested and did DNA verification on many of the strains. And then I started to I cracked open pills of ones available on the market and started combining them and created my own formula, and then showed all the QC data to my wife, who's also a background in microbiology, so no easy person to convince, and then finally got her agreement. And I think that was sort of the moment that I realized that this could be available more at a mass market level, and that we should be customizing these formulas for people. For him, it resolved his GI issues. When we retested, we saw those very probiotics that we had added to his GI system present. And the story is continuing. There's events that occur in his life where he takes an antibiotic and we retest him. And we make sure that his microbiome isn't gone to the wayside, or a new microbe hasn't seeded in that early stage of life. That could create long-term issues.
Yeah.
For me, I look at more things like, how can I improve my weight loss or my physique and
Right.
those types of things. I can say that my weight loss has gone well, and the profile seems to be handling all right. But I'm about to reformulate and do some more stuff, and it's kind of in phases. So every 3 or 4 months, I might change what I'm trying to target or try to achieve, assuming that I'm successful in the first stage. And if I'm not successful at the first stage, then I'll try to reformulate to keep working on it.
I think you brought up an interesting point that I think should be covered more. I mean, antibiotics blow out good bacteria and bad bacteria. It just blows out everything. So it just, right? So it seems interesting that, I guess standard care is not more thoughtful of post antibiotic treatment to rebuild your microfauna, right? Like it's because I mean, you're basically starting from scratch, and whatever ends up being there ends up taking over, right?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, when you were sick and you had to go on antibiotics, you might be quarantined a little bit more than what we do today. Modern life, we're on the go very fast.
Yeah.
And so we want to take an antibiotic and still keep working and still be exposed to the same microbes in the environment.
Right.
And right after you're done taking an antibiotic, it's like you can think of your gut flora as like a rainforest. And the antibiotic is just leveling everything in the rainforest, creating sort of free territory for any microbe to come and seed and colonize. And so the concept is, let's get the good microbes in there first before the bad microbes make their way there.
Right.
And if we get back into the world and we're exposed to all these potential pathogens and the bad microbes make it there, that could actually create long-term effects that are observed as dysbiosis or even some of these disease states.
Yeah.
So taking probiotics just after antibiotic treatment, I believe, is becoming a more standard paradigm in the medical community, and we would also recommend it as well.
Yeah, interesting. I think one question that I've thought about is, what's the chicken and the egg? So, is a faulty microbiome profile driving things like obesity or insulin resistance, or is because one has unhealthy diets of eating, processed foods, etc., causing your microbiome to evolve in a way that, or not evolve, but replace sort of like the good bacteria with the bad bacteria. What is your sense there? I mean, I imagine the answer is a bit of both, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what what are the levers as these microbiomes shift.
Yeah, it's an amazing complexity when we begin to incorporate into what disease and microbiome are associated and how are they associated and which came first.
Right.
I think we're still trying to understand the which came first aspect just as much as we're trying to understand the chicken and egg aspect. Right. So, I think we understand now that your microbiome can change based off of many factors, and that includes diet, environment.
Like fasting will change your microbiome. I mean, it's like interventions will change it very materially.
Yeah, that's right. And so being able to track and trend that over time is becoming more and more important so that you yourself can make decisions about what you want to impact, what you want to have impact your microbiome. And monitoring it to make sure it doesn't go into that sort of disease state is also critically important. So that you could potentially catch things as what I would call a signature before it sort of picks up into more of a chronic condition. I think that's where the science really is going to become interesting over the next few years, is how we use this as a preventive tool. And what is the preventive tool we use to help our microbiomes? Is it we start to exercise more? Is it we change our diets? Do we take a dietary supplement?
Right.
Do we take even more critical actions in therapeutics?
So is that the problem you're solving, Sun Genomics, sort of going from the data collection side, understanding the profile of microbiome changes over time, and then also creating interventions to manipulate those in the right direction? What is about? So I mean, I think it's like interesting because I think there's multiple. I'm curious how you see the ecosystem playing out, because you have companies like uBiome, which I think are more focused on the characterization side, and then you have companies that are focused on just like kind of one size fit all probiotics or prebiotic supplements. And it sounds like, from my understanding, you're trying to combine that into one seamless service.
Yes, and I feel that this information age of genomics is coming to an end, where the days of just providing information back to a consumer is no longer enough engagement for people to change something about their health or wellness. They've done studies now on the sort of the retroactive groups that have used the 23andMe test, and how many people actually made a change to their lifestyle based off of their genomics. And unfortunately, not many. And there's a reason why, because that behavioral change is infinitely more difficult than the other solutions. And the other solutions might be to take a dietary supplement. So at Sun Genomics, we're trying to tie that information into a real action. And now you have your dietary supplement. And not only is the supplement the action to help manage your microbiome, but it also could be that behavioral trigger, right? That sort of subconscious thing that you're doing, and then all of a sudden you start to eat better, you start to exercise more, because you're also tying now that action back to taking the supplements. So that's kind of the movement we want to create with our customer base. And so it's not only just becoming more aware and empowering the customer and the consumer, but also enabling everything else about their lifestyle so it fits in place.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good observation. I mean, I think having operated in this space, if you will, for the last 3-4 years, I mean, one of the critiques I think folks like us get is that, oh, is this Is this data too much data? Is it too complicated? Is it just information porn? What are people doing actively to actually implement changes, right? And I think you see that with continuous glucose monitoring. Some people will say, the average person doesn't understand it, or that's too much work. By knowing, just for me personally, just seeing my own glucose levels for the first time in real time, and seeing that if I drink a soda, it'll go up to 350 milligrams per deciliter, which is very, very high. And a normal meal, a healthy meal, I'll get up to like 150. Seeing that change quantitatively is so impactful, because I think we all know that drinking soda is probably not good for you, but just seeing the actual number of how not good for you, change my behavior, and reinforce good behavior. So I think what you're doing with, interventions on the gut microbiome, I think is this right approach. I think people are searching for these closed loops of rewarding action with short-term or relatively short-term measurable differences.
Yeah, that's right. And you take these refined sugars, and there could be a consequence to your gut microbiome as well. C. diff is a known a bad microbe of your gut, C. difficile, and when there's a lot of refined sugar around, it loves to grow and flourish, and that's not the one you want to grow and flourish, because that's what creates these chronic reoccurring issues in your GI system and inflammation. So really beginning to see how your actions are changing something about your human physiology is interesting, right? Yeah. And maybe that's wearing a fitness wearable and you're running a lot more and your resting heart rate is now dropping. Right. Maybe it's, that's that feedback loop that's engaging you more about your health.
Yeah. So what is the feedback loop on the gut microbiome? I mean, it's not like, you eat a probiotic and tomorrow your fauna is completely different. How long does it take to see a shift?
Yeah, we're seeing that as soon as a month after beginning precision probiotics, that our customers have a change to their probiotic profile and their overall microbiomes. We recommend quarterly retest, which is optional, or you can continue on the probiotics. But the real first thing is to test yourself, and that's the first thing we do. Is send out a test kit to the customer, and at their convenience, they can send that back to the lab. Yeah. We analyze their full microbiome profile and provide them with precision probiotics that they can begin for their next 3 months. And then they can retest and begin to see what changes actually happened. And real transparency, right? There's transparency to the probiotics we've provided now.
Right. So what's the difference between, the personalized approach versus what we could buy off of a GNC shelf? I mean, are those, overly broad, one size fits all? I mean, what are the current ones that you see in all the probiotic pills, like lactobacillus, A, B? I mean, are those reasonable general things? I mean, is yogurt, kimchi? I mean, I think you have all these fermented foods that people broadly say are beneficial probiotics. What's the data there? Is that kind of overly hand wavy, or is there real science behind like the general probiotics that we see on the market already?
I think those are healthy foods and healthy lifestyles to begin to look into. Now, when we started to study some of these functional foods as far as do the microbes themselves survive the gastric system, we found something quite astonishing. So we took tons of products off the shelf, including yogurts and including dietary supplements and probiotics. And when you put it through what we call a mini gut, which is basically a simulation of your stomach and the acids and biles and salts, and you try to plate out the number of microbes that would survive, we found that in almost 85% of the cases, it was completely eliminated. And so you weren't actually getting these live beneficial microbes to your intestines.
So hydrochloric acid in the stomach just kills all these guys.
Yeah, exactly. The pH is like 1.2 to 4 or so. It's really acidic. And your small intestine, the pH raises back to about 5 and 6. And that's where the microbes can actually grow. And then in your large intestine, they're around 7 or 8, where where things can further grow. So in the stomach, if they're just exposed to the environment, you eat a scoop of yogurt with a bunch of live cultures. I mean, it's an acid bath for them, right? They're not going to be able to survive.
Yeah. Cool. So how did you solve that problem?
So we've developed some technology at Sun Genomics where not only the screening methods we use for probiotics strains we're using include ones that survive acidic conditions, but also the encapsulation. So the pill that we're providing is able to survive the low pH conditions of your stomach, and then when it reaches 5.5, that's when the pill dissolves. And so the full essentially load of microbial content will be released when it reaches your small intestine that way.
Okay, so it's not like a typical gelatin capsule or like a cellulose capsule. This is a special capsule that I guess it dissolves at the specific pH range that you're trying to target, which is the small intestine.
Yeah, it's an FDA-approved capsule that is a vegetable base, so it's not gelatin, and so it's a rare find for us to have this type of technology tied to our dietary supplement delivery as well. So we're really excited about how its performance has been, and we're putting up some new side-by-side comparisons soon on the website.
I think one thing that I'd also be curious to dive into are interesting postbiotics. So I know a lot of our listeners are interested in ketogenic diets, ketones. And I've read literature around how some types of fauna might generate or throw off beta hydroxybutyrate or ketone bodies as byproducts. That would be interesting for a lot of people looking to elevate ketone levels, to get into a more ketogenic state without having to do fasting or eat crazy diets, or without having to use exogenous ketones like some of our products. I'm curious, have you looked into ketone-related postbiotics, or if not that specifically, what are interesting postbiotics that are on your radar or people should be thinking more about?
Yeah, we haven't specifically looked at that. We do agree that's an interesting way to be able to enhance sort of your dietary state in providing the ketones. And there are things called digestive enzymes that you could also take, that are kind of postbiotics that are a supplement essentially. Studies around which probiotics would best benefit that exact type of phenotype, I think, are still in progress. Is there a future which we could figure that out potentially? And I think at this stage, it's a little too early to understand specifically with that example that you're giving. But as far as postbiotics in general, short chain fatty acids and butyrate release are good things that probiotics can release and improve your microbiome health. These things kind of bring up the good microbes of your gut. You even mentioned fasting, and fasting actually helps bring up some of the good microbes and deplete energy sources from the bad microbes.
Right.
And that's
so
where sometimes
glucose, right?
Yeah, exactly. The 16-hour fast might be a good thing to try out, and it can help bring up the good. But if you wake up in the morning and then eat a Pop-Tart, it may not be the best thing to do.
Right.
So it just kind of depends on how that fits into your lifestyle.
Yeah. I think it is all about measuring, right? I think especially our audience, I mean, you have to be quantitative, and I think a service like yours where, you're doing all these interventions and the microbiome is something that is getting more and more understood and something that we can manipulate. If you can change it within a month or a quarter, I mean, it seems reasonable that one should be tracking this over time. And I think that's like the whole, my sense of how healthcare is going to evolve. For right now, it's very much a snapshot of some, blood panels, some panels that your doctor, gives you once a year, maybe, if you're really on top of it. And if you can get services and techniques and sensors where you can get a lot of this data continuously, I think more and more people can make better informed decisions on a more continuous basis, rather than like, oh my gosh, last year I had this kind of thing, now I need to take prescription drugs, and next year I got to do like a completely different thing. And it seems like almost backwards to me, where we continuously update almost every other piece of hardware we own, our cars, our computers, we constantly know the stats and all that, but we don't know the stats of things that are really important to our own health, like, our microbiome.
Yeah, such a good point. Let's begin to empower each other with that information, and we've got the tools to do it now. And it's more about engaging with it, and we hope we can put out a report and probiotic formula that really helps people feel good, but also see the truth behind what's happening.
Awesome. Anything else we should talk about that we haven't covered?
Well, one thing that's interesting between feeling better is this new field of gut-brain access.
Yes.
And we're now understanding just how important the vagus nerve and the nerves in the intestines are in connecting to our mind. And so probiotics are now being looked at and put into this field of gut-brain access. And it's a very interesting field that we're interested to participate in. Actually, our chief, one of our lead scientists is a neuroscience PhD and has an interest in that as well. So we're excited for the future of managing things well beyond just traditional digestive health and really into overall wellness and from, sort of a mind and body and GI system.
Yeah, I think one of the facts that are less well known is that the gut is one of the biggest producers and receptors of neurotransmitters, right? Like serotonin, dopamine, like there's sensors and receptors for things that we associate with cognition. So yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, do you have any thoughts or additional thoughts in that area, in that line?
Well, some people have even described it as far as the gut being maybe the
second brain.
The second brain or the control room of our GI system or of our bodies. We understand that there's those release of serotonin and good neurotransmitters in the GI system, and beginning to explore that. I'd love to see the studies done in a more clinical fashion around this, but we already know and can appreciate improvements from just surveys and customer feedback of how they're feeling, their moods when on probiotics. So we're already seeing the needle move there as far as survey feedback, but there's still some ways to go on tying all the complete science into that complex system. It's amazing, just 4 or 5 years ago, we didn't appreciate that the number of microbes in our bodies actually is equivalent to the number of cells in our bodies.
Yeah.
So they are an equal mass of cellular material of that is living in and around our bodies. And you can just think, if your human cells have that impact to your human physiology, then why wouldn't your microbial cells have an impact to your physiology? So we're beginning to now really appreciate that.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, how do our listeners follow your work? How do we find and stay in touch here? sungenomics.com.
That's right. So on the website, Sungenomics, SUNGENOMICS, sungenomics.com, you can find out more information about Flore, which is the product that I've described here with the test microbiome and your precision probiotics. We're also on Twitter pretty actively and like to write about and talk about recent microbiome scientific literature on there. If you follow us on Facebook, you can see some more fun information about the team and things that we're up to on a daily basis. And we're just trying to engage as many people with their microbiomes, and love to hear from any of the listeners. They're welcome to email me as well. My email is sunny@sungenomics.com.
Awesome. Is that based on your own name?
The company is actually the company is actually based off of more of the concept around Sun Genomics being a second operating system, much like a former operating system in Sun Microsystems. That was kind of how
that's a nerdy way to
formed.
Yeah, that's a nerdy way to link it up. Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. That was a fun conversation with Sunny. I think the gut microbiome has been definitely one of the most asked for in intriguing topics recently because there's just more and more literature published in the space. And I think the big question is, what can we do with the science? How real is the science, and how robust is the science? And it sounds like the Sun Genomics team has the right approach in quantifying and giving the right tools to measure outcomes of the interventions that they're producing. I imagine there's a lot of interesting overlap with what you guys are interested in out there and what we're doing at Human. So I imagine that Zil and our team here will continue to keep in touch and update on the microbiome side of things. As always, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm not going to talk about the subscription stuff because you guys know the channels that we're on, but any feedback, questions, ratings, it's always appreciated. Thanks so much, and see you next week.